I'm a survivor of a government experiment. They say you'll always remember the moment your life splits in two. For me, it wasn't some dramatic explosion or a voice whispering secrets in the dark. It was a plain manila envelope left on the dashboard of my car. No postage, no fingerprints, no explanation. Just my name in typed black ink. First name only, as if the rest had already been erased. I don't know how long I sat there staring at it, the windows fogging from my breath, the engine off, the air growing stale. I was parked outside the diner where I worked graveyard shifts, waiting for a manager who was always late and a paycheck that never came on time. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like it contained more than just paper, like it carried weight in the metaphysical sense. Inside, there were three things: a one-way train ticket to a town I'd never heard of, a waiver with a signature line already marked with my full legal name, and a slip of paper with a phone number and one sentence: return what was taken. I should have tossed it, I know that now. I should have laughed, maybe burned it, maybe handed it to the cops or at least Googled the damn town. But there was something underneath the absurdity that felt too real to ignore. Like an itch behind my eyes, or a memory I couldn't access pressing against the edges of my awareness. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, some viral marketing stunt or a scam. But I packed anyway. No goodbyes. Just a duffel bag and the quiet resignation of a man with nothing left to lose. The train ride was uneventful, if unsettling. I was the only passenger in my car, and the conductor never once came through. The windows were too dirty to see out of, but the landscape seemed wrong. Trees with too many branches, birds that didn't flap their wings. The static on the intercom had rhythm, like breathing. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I heard clicking, like teeth or bones. The destination was a place called Larchwood, buried deep in some unnamed part of the Pacific Northwest, not even marked on the train schedule. The station was derelict, overgrown with ivy, the metal rusted through like it hadn't been used in decades. There was no one to greet me, only a black SUV with tinted windows waiting by the platform, engine idling. I got in without a word. The driver never spoke, not once. His eyes were hidden behind mirrored sunglasses even though the sun had already begun to set. We drove for hours, the road winding into hills that grew sharper, darker, until the forest swallowed all light and the radio began to buzz like it was suffocating. We passed a sign that had been blacked out with spray paint, but I saw letters beneath the blotches, military font, old and utilitarian. The gate was guarded by two men with no insignias, no names, just blank fatigues, and rifles cradled in arms too still to be natural. They didn't ask for identification. They just waved us through. The facility was half buried in the side of a mountain, reinforced concrete and steel beams warped with age. It didn't look like a lab. It looked like a tomb that didn't know it was supposed to be buried. I was processed by a woman who never gave her name, only a badge number that started with X and ended with nothing. She scanned my retina, took a blood sample, and handed me another manila folder with instructions that made no sense. No interaction. No speech unless prompted. No questions. No unauthorized memories. That last one haunted me the most. They gave me a uniform with no insignia, a room with no windows, and a number, 41. There were others, dozens of us, maybe more, but we weren't allowed to speak. We passed each other in hallways with eyes cast down, shoulders hunched like prisoners trying not to be noticed by their jailer. The halls were lined with security cameras, but none of them ever moved. Still, I felt watched. Not just observed, but studied. Like I was prey. The first week passed in a haze of routine and silence. We were led in small groups to testing chambers filled with equipment I didn't recognize. Machines that hissed and clicked, electrodes that pulsed with no discernible rhythm, helmets with wires like veins that tightened the longer you wore them. They told us we were here for cognitive enhancement. They used words like neural optimization, sensory recalibration, adaptive reprogramming. But what they meant was erasure. I felt it in the gaps. Little things at first. Forgetting which hand I wrote with. Misplacing objects I never brought. Hearing conversations I hadn't had. Seeing people I didn't know but felt familiar. Then came the dreams. Or what I thought were dreams. Places too vast to be real. Corridors that bent back into themselves. Doors that opened into light that burned in reverse. I woke up with nosebleeds and a taste in my mouth like rust. One night, I found a word etched into my bathroom mirror, though I hadn't written it. Remember. I tried to report it, but my handler just stared at me, as if I'd spoken in a language they hadn't programmed in. I wasn't sure who was running this place. I heard whispers about something called Project Syndrel. I found it scribbled in the margins of a discarded clipboard, half erased, like someone wanted it forgotten but couldn't quite let it go. There were rumors, always in passing, always cut short, about an incident years ago. A blackout. A breach. Something that wasn't meant to return. One night, I saw someone dragged down the corridor outside my room. They were screaming in a voice that sounded like mine, but distorted, like it had been played backward and underwater. No one acknowledged it the next day. No one even blinked. That's when I started keeping notes. Not on paper. They'd find that. I wrote on my skin, in code, using dots and dashes, remembering every placement like a tattoo of defiance. If I forgot who I was, I'd trace the marks and read myself back into existence. I don't know how long I've been here. The clocks don't work, and the days bleed into each other like oil in water. They said we'd be compensated after Phase 3, that the $20,000 was just the first payment. But I haven't seen money. I haven't seen the sky. I haven't seen my own reflection in weeks. I think they're trying to turn us into something. Or worse, trying to let something else in. Through us, with us, as us. I don't know who's reading this. I don't know if anyone is. But if you found this, if these words still exist somewhere beyond the walls, they haven't won yet. I'm still here, I remember, and I'm not alone. I drove 6 hours north with nothing but the printed list folded inside my jacket, and a vague recollection of a place that, according to every satellite image and government registry I checked, had never existed. My memory of it was more sensation than geography. An elongated corridor that smelled of metal and mold, fluorescent lights flickering in sync with my pulse, and the echo of boots on grated steel. I couldn't picture the exterior, or even recall how I had first arrived. But there was a lingering pressure behind my eyes that pulsed with recognition as I followed the barely marked backroads toward the edge of state lines. The forest grew denser, swallowing the road into its branches like a body rejecting a foreign object. Cell service disappeared miles ago, and the silence around me became so complete that I began to hear the blood in my ears as a dull roar, like distant machinery warming up. My GPS stuttered, looped the same coordinates 3 times, then froze entirely. I ditched the car at the tree line and followed a broken service path on foot, each step sinking slightly into wet moss and gravel, until I reached a wide clearing that was too symmetrical to be natural. At the center stood a concrete foundation, overgrown but intact, the outline of what once had to be a structure. Square, utilitarian, industrial. There were no signs, no fencing, no markings on the cracked concrete. But I felt it before I saw it. Something beneath. A low vibration in the soles of my feet. A mechanical purr like a generator idling underground. Something was still alive here. I began digging around the perimeter, not with tools, but with instinct, fingers scraping moss and broken tile until I uncovered a rusted metal hatch, sealed with an industrial lever and a keypad long since corroded. The hinges screamed in protest when I forced it open, revealing a vertical shaft and a rusted ladder descending into black. The air that came out was sterile, cold, and tinged with antiseptic. My breath steamed as I dropped inside and began the slow descent into the past they told me never happened. The ladder led down for what felt like stories, and eventually I reached a maintenance tunnel, wide enough for 2 people but clearly never meant for public access. The walls were concrete, but painted in lines of faded green and yellow, some still readable in the beam of my flashlight. Medical D-Wing. Decontamination zone. Test staging. Restricted. The deeper I went, the more the silence evolved into something alive, a low thrum that lived behind the walls, punctuated by occasional ticks and metallic groans, as if the place breathed in slow, mechanical intervals. I turned a corner and found the remnants of what had once been a security station. Shattered glass, overturned monitors, and a wall-mounted map, partially torn but legible enough to offer orientation. The facility layout was expansive. At least 4 floors, dozens of rooms. Many labeled in alphanumeric codes that gave no hint as to their function. Some wings had been burned out completely. Others remained preserved, like the decay had paused mid-process. I passed rooms with broken observation windows, and in one, the remains of a containment tank split down the middle, black residue still clinging to its edges like something organic had ruptured it from within. There were signs of hasty evacuation, chairs overturned, documents half burned or shredded, drawers left open, but no bodies. No signs of life or death, just absence. As if the people here had been erased alongside the project. I reached the core wing marked Surgical Theater B3 and found doors made of reinforced metal, still sealed. The keypad blinked dead, but above the door, a security camera turned slowly toward me. It powered on with a whir. No red light, no movement after that. Just the quiet presence of something watching, acknowledging me. I stepped back, and that's when I noticed the room across the hall, its door ajar. I slipped inside and found what looked like a personnel locker room. Nameplates had been removed from most of the doors, but one still remained. It read, F. Carr, Lead Observer. Inside the locker was a lab coat, several identification badges with scrubbed barcodes, and a small data drive sealed in a lead-lined pouch. It looked new, recent, like it hadn't been there as long as everything else. I pocketed it without hesitation. On the back wall of the room was a faded chalkboard, with scribbled notes that had survived only in fragments. Phrases like stabilization failed, subject alpha collapse, C11.3.6, and a final scrawl, written in thick black grease pen. Memory erasure incomplete, risk of residual loop, send to field for remote observation. That's when I saw it. Taped beneath the board, barely holding, was a grainy black and white photograph. In it, 5 people stood in a row, all wearing surgical uniforms. 4 of their faces had been scratched out violently with something sharp. The 5th was mine, untouched, smiling. I don't remember this picture being taken. I don't remember the people beside me, but I remember the corridor behind us. It was the same one I had walked through minutes ago. My fingers began to tremble as I realized I wasn't just here before. I had worked here. I had worn the coat. I had access. This wasn't just a place where something had happened to me. It was where I had done something. I left the room in a daze, stumbling back through the halls. The power flickered, and the overhead lights came to life for the first time in decades. A single hallway ahead of me illuminated, red, like an artery leading to the heart. At the end, a door hissed open. I followed. Inside was a control room, terminals long dead but one screen still active, displaying a simple message. Subject 0, status, active, location, external. There was a profile summary beneath it, blurred, encrypted, but some lines were readable. Phase 4 development. Partial amnesia approved. Monitor integration successful. At the bottom, a final line blinked. Reintegration pending. I backed away. Whatever I was, wherever I had been placed, it was by design. I wasn't off-grid. I was part of a loop. And now, returning here, I had activated something dormant. A low mechanical hum started beneath the floor. Somewhere deep below, a generator kicked to life. A system rebooted. Screens blinked on in sequence. One by one, file directories appeared on the main console, labeled with names, some familiar, some crossed out. Mine was first. Callie's name appeared second. The rest, blank. The facility had no official name. It wasn't listed on any database, military or civilian. But it was awake now, and it remembered me. I should have left when the lights came on. That was the rational choice, the human reaction, to run when something buried stirs. But I stayed. Not because I was brave, but because the feeling that had followed me since I first saw my name on that list wasn't fear. It was familiarity. I knew the rhythm of this place. I knew its breathing, and now it knew mine. I descended again, past the glowing directory, past the scorched medical wing, following the line of red lights guiding me like blood through veins. The further I moved, the less the air smelled like rot and rust, and more like antiseptic. Still sharp, still sterile, like the facility had only just been cleaned. The hallways here were narrower, not meant for gurneys or groups. They bent unnaturally, without symmetry or logic, folding in upon themselves as if the entire substructure had been built for disorientation. At the end of the passage was a door unlike the others. No designation, no keypad. Just a smooth, seamless slab of white, like bone. When I placed my hand on it, it sighed open. The room beyond was blindingly white, floor to ceiling, coated in material that wasn't quite tile and wasn't quite steel. It absorbed no sound, no reflection, no warmth. It was an asylum without walls. In the center sat a single chair. Strapped, surrounded by a ring of ceiling-mounted rods and cables dangling like surgical tendrils. No cameras, no monitors, no mirrors. And that was what struck me hardest. There wasn't a single reflective surface anywhere, not even a polished button or a brushed panel, just absence. As if whoever built this place feared seeing themselves or what they'd become. I stepped closer. The chair wasn't dusty. The straps were intact. The floor around it was clean. Too clean. It hadn't been abandoned like the rest, it had been waiting. As I circled it, I felt the temperature drop, not physically but neurologically. My skin crawled. My vision contracted. Something was pressing against my skull from within. I staggered back, and that's when the voice returned. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense. It didn't echo or vibrate. It bloomed in the back of my head like a memory you forget you buried. It said, "You signed. You said yes. Wake up." The same words from the list, the same ones that whispered through my dreamless nights. But now they had a source. I turned to find no one. Just the chair. Empty. Expectant. A low, harmonic pulse filled the space. Almost inaudible, but rhythmic enough to unsettle the balance in my ears. My hands shook. I took a step back, and my heel struck something soft. A coat, folded on the floor. It was mine. Identical in every way to the one I wore when I entered the facility hours ago. Same size, same label, same stain on the inner pocket from the pen I'd broken in a nervous tic last week. But that was impossible. I hadn't taken this coat off. I hadn't even unzipped it. Yet here it was, neatly folded like it had been prepared for me. I backed away again, and the lights dimmed slightly. Not as a malfunction, but as if responding to my uncertainty. Then the door behind me closed with a soft hiss. Locked. I was alone, or being watched. The voice returned, this time louder, less fragmented. "You are not lost. You are released." My heart raced, but my feet refused to move. I stepped toward the chair, not because I trusted it, but because it was the only object in the world that seemed to know more about me than I did. I sat. The straps didn't activate. Nothing clamped down. But the rods above shimmered, coming to life in sequence, each emitting a thin beam of blue light that traced the contour of my skull. Then the pulse returned, this time deeper, vibrating through the marrow of my bones. Flash. Not light, but memory, or something pretending to be. I saw myself walking through a hallway, younger, dressed in a lab coat, speaking with someone whose face was permanently blurred, like old surveillance footage degraded by time. We argued. I remember the tension, the sense of betrayal. Then, flash. I was in this same room, but on the other side, observing someone in the chair, someone strapped down, someone screaming without making a sound. I couldn't see their face, not because the memory wouldn't let me, but because I refused to look. I blinked, and the vision collapsed. Sweat poured down my spine. I tried to stand, but my body wasn't listening. The voice spoke again, and now I recognized it. My own. "This was your choice. Forgetting was permission." The beams retracted. The lights faded. The door opened. I stumbled out of the room, legs weak, mouth dry. I had gone in hoping to find what they'd done to me. I left knowing I had done it to myself. I moved back through the corridor, but the path had changed. The hallway bent differently, led somewhere new. These walls weren't just physical. They were cognitive, malleable. This place adjusted to thought, to pattern, to trauma. It was a labyrinth of memory dressed as a facility. It didn't want to be understood. It wanted to be felt, navigated like a dream, not a building. I reached an atrium-like chamber filled with rusted machinery, dormant servers, and a single humming terminal still online. On its screen blinked a file labeled Integration Report, Phase 3. I opened it, hands trembling. The document was heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out. But one paragraph remained intact. Subject 0 was given full agency in memory reconstruction. Upon exposure to core trauma, subject elected self-erasure of incident via harmonic trigger. Ethical review panel was overridden by clearance Zeta. Observation continues under open environment parameters. There was no doubt anymore. I hadn't escaped the program. I was the program. A living fragment released into the world like a seed to see if memory regrew in wild soil. Every action I took had been predicted, modeled, monitored. And now that I had returned, the system had rebooted. The room with no mirrors wasn't hiding something. It was reflecting everything back to me in a medium I couldn't avoid. My own mind. The absence of glass wasn't a mistake. It was a message. What you are cannot be seen, only recalled. And I had just begun to remember. The wound was small, a jagged scratch along my forearm from brushing against a protruding wire back in the server room. At the time, I hardly noticed it. My thoughts were still tangled in the phrase, Subject Zero was given full agency, and the implications that I had authored my own oblivion. But as I reached the outskirts of the facility's ruins, the cold morning air brushed against the exposed skin of my forearm, and I finally looked down. The blood had dried almost instantly. No crust, no scabbing, just a faint sheen of crystallized maroon, shimmering slightly like dried resin under the light. I pressed my fingers to it, and it didn't flake. It didn't smear. It resisted, like hardened polymer. It was wrong. I left the area before anyone could see me. A service tunnel ran beneath the southern perimeter, opening out near the base of an abandoned utility station. I stayed there for hours, hidden beneath layers of rusted metal and earth, watching the skin around the wound refuse to swell, refuse to bruise, refuse to ache. I tried wiping it with alcohol, then peroxide. Nothing changed. It was like the flesh had sealed and evolved in a single motion, rejecting any hint of normal biological response. My hands were trembling when I called Adrian. Adrian Wu had once been a rogue biologist for a defense subcontractor. Fired under sealed circumstances, reappeared 5 years later in the underbelly of the medical black market. He owed me. Or at least, he owed someone who once wore my face. We met in a shuttered dental office 3 counties over. Its signage faded, windows blacked out with garbage bags and duct tape. Inside, Adrian was hunched over a centrifuge from the Cold War era, sipping instant coffee from a chipped mug labeled Pre-1 Virologist. He didn't look up when I entered, just pointed to the chair. Left arm. No sudden movements. I didn't ask how he knew. I was past pretending things like that weren't possible. He took a sample with gloved hands, studied it under a series of ancient microscopes and half-salvaged imaging tools. His silence stretched. Then it folded into something worse. Visible unease. He printed 3 slides. Then 5. Then 10. Finally, he turned toward me with eyes that had stopped blinking. Where the hell have you been? I told him only what I had to. The list, the facility, the room. I left out the chair and the voice, not out of mistrust but necessity. The truth came out crooked when spoken aloud, like it couldn't survive outside my skull. Adrian didn't argue. He just pulled up a monitor and brought the blood image into focus. This shouldn't exist, he muttered. It's not blood. It's not entirely yours either. He showed me the cells. Or what remained of them. The red blood cells were denser, almost crystalline, with a nucleus where none should exist. The plasma carried unfamiliar compounds, proteins with synthetic backbones, markers that didn't match any known genetic lineage. My leukocytes had aggressive resistance traits, clustered in patterns that resembled military encryption algorithms more than anything biological. It's not just altered, he said. It's designed. I sat in the chair for a long time, feeling the weight of something inside me that wasn't mine, that maybe had never been mine. Could it be a transfusion? I asked, grasping for something human. Adrian shook his head. No record of such proteins in any black budget I've ever seen. This wasn't added to you. You were built with it. This is foundational, and it's stable. I could try sequencing it fully, but that would flag every internal system from here to Langley. You're a walking red alert. He paused, then leaned forward. Have you noticed anything else? I hesitated, told him about the transmission. Subject 6. The voice in the walls, the lack of memory, and the dreams. Especially the dreams. His expression shifted from clinical curiosity to something closer to fear. He nodded slowly. I've seen this before. Once. Maybe twice. They called it convergent modulation. Rewriting not just tissue, but instinct, reflex, reaction, creating a physiological feedback loop that adapts faster than trauma can occur. I stared at the slide, at the image of my own cells arrayed like an alien constellation. What does that mean exactly? Adrian rubbed his forehead. It means your body won't just heal. It'll learn. From everything. From impact. From injury. From fear. You're becoming a system. One that doesn't need to remember in order to know. I left, without taking the slides. Adrian insisted on burning them. They'll track me if I keep these, he said. They always do. As I stepped back into the dark, a gust of wind carried the smell of something that didn't belong. Ozone, salt, and static. I turned back toward the office, but Adrian had already locked the door. I haven't heard from him since. Back in my car, I sat with the engine off, staring at the wound on my arm. Still no redness. Still no pain. Just a thin line of inhuman order where chaos should have been. I thought about the woman on the radio, Subject 6. What had they done to her? What had they done to me? And why leave me out here in the open? Unless that was the experiment, to see what I became, uncontained. Over the following nights, I began testing myself. Small things at first. Bruises that vanished in hours. Lacerations that closed before I could clean them. Sleep that brought no rest but somehow restored more than it should. My vision sharpened in darkness. My hearing extended to frequencies I'd never perceived. But it wasn't just enhancements. It was alien. I felt partitioned inside. Like there was a core function still asleep, waiting to be triggered. Like a system waiting for a signal. The final confirmation came during a fever dream, 4 nights after the lab. I was floating in a room with no gravity, no walls, only data, streaming symbols, pulsing nodes, numbers folding into faces. One of them was mine, but not the version I knew. It was older, or younger, or recompiled. It smiled. Then it spoke. You're not broken. You're the checksum. I woke up with blood on my pillow. Not from my nose. From my ears. I touched it, expecting panic. But the blood wasn't red. It was silver. And it glowed in the dark. It began with static, but not the kind you forget. It was mechanical, rigid, timed. Like something that wanted to pretend it was noise, but wasn't quite able to fool anyone paying real attention. I was staying in a rundown motel 3 states over, under a name I didn't recognize as mine. Using cash that didn't match my memory of the withdrawal. My dreams had grown more fragmented since Adrian's disappearance. I had called his number 3 times. The last time, a voice I didn't know answered and said, "No one here ever knew that name," before the line went dead. I never tried again. The motel had a shortwave radio in the wall. It was rusted, analog, an afterthought for guests who couldn't afford the digital age. The kind of relic no one noticed anymore. But I noticed it when it turned on by itself at 3:12 a.m. The room was silent, pitch black, save for the blinking red LED from the smoke detector. Then a soft click, and the room filled with a low, slow hiss. At first, I thought it was a wiring fault. Motel tech often fails in strange ways. But the hiss shifted. It modulated, undulated, developed rhythm. Then came a tone. Deep, vibrating in a way I felt more in my ribcage than my ears. It triggered something. Not memory. Instinct. My spine stiffened. My throat dried. The corners of my vision bent inward, like the walls were subtly closing around me. And then, amid the synthetic fog, a voice broke through. Faint, female, panicked, repeating the same phrase. Is this subject 1? Confirm if alive. Is this subject 1? Confirm if alive. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't open, as if part of me already knew that acknowledging the transmission was irreversible. But the voice persisted. Not in a loop. Each instance had a different inflection. Sometimes desperate. Sometimes mechanical. On the 6th iteration, she added something new. They let you out to see what happens. You're the final stage. They called it cognitive wildfire. You burn through the system from the inside out. There was a pause, then a stifled cry, then a whisper. They're watching through your latency. Stop thinking out loud. Then the tone returned, higher now, more jagged, like barbed wire strung across the inside of my skull. My hand moved to switch off the unit, but my fingers shook violently. I had no control over the tremors. I realized I was sweating in places I didn't know had glands. Every sound seemed to split and multiply in my head. There was a brief flash behind my eyes, and then I blacked out. When I came to, it was morning. The radio was silent. Its dial cracked. My ears rang, but not with tinnitus. With that same low-frequency pitch I had heard in the white room, just beneath the conscious layer. I left the motel without checking out. burned the cash, changed phones. But the voice stayed with me. Not just in memory. I began hearing her during the day, not as hallucinations, but distortions, beneath music, behind traffic, inside crowds. She would say different things now, not to warn me, but to remind me. The walls aren't real. Time isn't constant. Your decisions are being profiled. The next major break came when I found an abandoned ham radio station in a desert town, whose only claim to existence was a single post office and a diner without a sign. The transmitter still worked. I didn't know the code or the frequency, but my hands did. I tuned by muscle memory, landing on a channel labeled UNX 947B. There was a delay, then a click, then the same voice. "You found it," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd retain that pathway. They randomized your signal trees after Alaska." "Who are you?" I asked aloud, surprised I could speak. She sighed. A human sound. Too human. Subject 6. I'm the only one who remembers before the reboots. They let me bleed out just enough to keep the signal alive. I've been awake for 6 years. Maybe more. You're different, you know. They kept you dormant for longer. They called you the final variable. What does that mean? I demanded. Why me? Because you said yes, she answered. Because you volunteered to be the one who decides whether the others wake up. You were built to hold the weight of the protocol. All of it. And now they're watching to see if you snap or synchronize. I froze. My heart didn't race. It slowed. Too slow. Like my body was adapting to the gravity of what I was hearing in real time. Why tell me this? I asked. Why now? Because you're about to cross into the next phase. And once you do, you'll start forgetting again. That's how they keep the waveform clean, by scrambling internal memory after external contamination. I'm the contamination. I'm not supposed to be talking to you. She hesitated. I heard something in the background, shouts, static, then a burst of feedback. They've triangulated, she whispered. They'll kill this signal. But remember this. The missing days are the key. They hide what you really are in the gaps. Don't trust sleep. Don't trust silence. And for God's sake, if you hear the countdown, run. Then silence. A silence that rang louder than anything I'd heard. The line died. The station's power grid popped and shut down. I sat there in the dark for hours, the last phrase echoing through every layer of my cognition. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for the next 5 nights either. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of what would take over if I did. I began reviewing surveillance footage from wherever I stayed. Libraries, gas stations, bus stops. I watched myself stand still for hours, blinking but not moving. Once, I saw myself speak to someone who wasn't there. Another time, I watched as I took off my shoes and buried them in sand, only to retrieve them the next day without memory of doing so. I stopped being sure that the voice was outside me. Maybe she was embedded, a failsafe, an echo from a previous configuration. Maybe all of this was just the prelude, the calibration stage, and I was the test subject who'd been allowed to forget long enough to act natural. Just long enough for the protocol to embed without rejection. Now every time I hear static, I listen. Every flicker in fluorescent lights could be a signal. Every malfunction a message. My reflection lags sometimes in mirrors. My breath fogs glass on delay. My thoughts occasionally finish before I've had them. These aren't metaphors. They're symptoms of something sinking. She said not to trust silence. So now I leave the radio on at all times, tuned to empty frequencies. I hope I'll hear her again. I fear that when I do, it won't be her anymore. It'll be whatever waits after her, whatever took her place, whatever comes next. It began as a pattern I couldn't deny. Small absences camouflaged by the monotony of routine. At first, I dismissed them as stress-induced fatigue, the product of adrenaline and paranoia blending into mental static. But then the gaps began to widen, stretching into spans of time that simply weren't there. I would wake up in unfamiliar places, warehouses, underpasses, train stations, with no recollection of how I had gotten there. And worse, no evidence that I had ever left where I was before. Receipts in my pockets from stores I didn't remember visiting, cash exchanges for items I didn't own, scribbled notes in handwriting, almost like mine, but not quite. The phrases were disjointed. Not yet. Keep the window open. Remember the skin isn't yours. One note had only coordinates. When I checked, They pointed to a closed trauma clinic in an industrial part of Baltimore that had burned down 3 years ago. Yet when I stood in front of it, staring at the scorched stone and twisted iron, I felt something tighten in my chest, a memory just out of reach, trembling behind my ribcage. I began reviewing my own security footage, dash cams, motel CCTV, even rigged cameras hidden in my clothing. But the footage was wrong. In one file, I watched myself stand in front of a bathroom mirror for 4 hours, unmoving except for the occasional blink. No phone in hand, no grooming, just stillness, as if I were waiting for something to catch up. In another, I was seen pacing a bus station for nearly an hour, stopping only to touch a poster on the wall with my palm, over and over. When I paused the frame, I saw the poster had a name, mine. Not my alias, not the name on my forged documents, but my real one. The one I had stopped using since I found the list. My heart pounded. When I returned to the station in person, the poster was gone. Not torn, not defaced, just absent, like it had never existed. I began cross-referencing medical records, trying to understand if something physical was failing in me. The body was the only constant I could still touch. I requested imaging under assumed identities, faked symptoms to get tests, slipped bribes into the hands of technicians to see results off the record. What I found wasn't just abnormal, it was structurally impossible. I had a scar along my left kidney that didn't correspond to any surgical history, but worse. The kidney itself was the wrong density, containing trace metals not present in normal organ tissue. A biopsy, done by a sympathetic ex-military doctor who owed me more than a favor, revealed synthetic proteins bonded to my epithelial layer. My blood had already told me part of the story, but now I knew more. Parts of me were not me. Organs transplanted in without record. Bones reinforced. The structure of my nervous system denser than it should be. Reactions to stimuli faster than human baseline. The doctor told me, bluntly, this isn't black market enhancement. This is institutional. And whoever did this didn't want it found. He disappeared 3 days later. I found his home ransacked, equipment gone, hard drives melted from within. I had never given him my real name, never shared where I was staying. Still, they found him, and they erased him. My paranoia reached new levels. I installed dead man switches on my communication devices, encoded fail-safes into burner phones that would upload voice memos to offshore servers if I went dark for more than 24 hours. But the more I tried to guard the perimeter of my reality, the more the interior of it crumbled. One night, I set up motion sensors in my hotel room. Simple, infrared, battery-powered. The kind you can get in spy shops for cash. I slept with a camera rolling. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, there was a 3-hour blank spot. Not static, not darkness. A clean wipe. The file jumped from 1:03 a.m. to 4:07 a.m. with no timecode skip, as if the intervening hours had never existed. And when I looked at the data logs from the sensors, I saw them register movement during those same hours. My own shape walking, standing, even exiting the room. But the camera saw nothing. That's when I began to suspect the missing days weren't just about memory. They were system-wide. Something external to me, maybe hardware, maybe biochemical, was removing time itself from my perception. I began tracking myself with GPS modules sewn into my clothes, encrypted to mirror locations to a separate server. The results were staggering. Over the course of 1 week, I had traveled through 6 states, stayed in 9 different motels, made 17 purchases, and visited 5 government buildings, none of which I remembered. The receipts were there. Surveillance caught me, but I wasn't inside any of it. My sense of self, who I was, what I remembered, what I had done, was no longer connected to the timeline. My life had forked. Someone was living my body while I slept behind my own eyes. Then came the worst moment of confirmation. I found a file, buried in a digital archive under layers of obfuscation. It wasn't labeled with my name, but with a designation, MKD-12, Cognitive Disassociation Prototype. The file included biometric logs, schedule entries, timestamps. One line in particular arrested me completely. Subject begins Phase 4 separation. Memory to be suppressed during procedural hours. Organ modifications complete. Psychological tolerance beyond projected index. Recommend controlled release into unstructured environment. I read it 20 times. Controlled release. That meant I hadn't escaped. I had been released, placed back into the world to be observed. I was not the result of an experiment. I was the experiment, ongoing, monitored, logged, studied. One more file had my attention. It was an audio clip, corrupted in part, but still decipherable. It was a voice, mine, but laced with synthetic overlays, like it had been processed to remove emotion. The voice said, "Subject aware of gaps. Contingency required. Prepare resynchronization protocol." That was when I realized that even now, even as I peeled back layers of illusion, they were already adjusting. The experiment wasn't linear. It evolved with me. My defiance wasn't resistance. It was another data point. I don't know what's real anymore, but I know what isn't. The memories I still have, some of them are planted. I feel it in the way they arrive. Too clean, too cinematic. The blood in my veins, engineered. The days I can't recall, occupied by someone or something else. But I also know this. They didn't erase all of me. They left a crack, a thread, and I'm following it. Because somewhere inside this fractured timeline, buried beneath synthetic proteins and silenced time, there's a truth I wasn't meant to see, and I will find it, before they decide it's time to take me back. The first time it happened, I was on a back road somewhere in Vermont, driving north through a dense stretch of forest with no cell service, and only the sound of gravel beneath my tires to remind me I was still in motion. I had been driving for hours, trying to outpace the unraveling inside my head, the gaps, the double lives, the files that didn't belong to any world I recognized. That's when the static came through the car's radio. I hadn't turned it on, yet it hummed to life with a whispering frequency so low I almost didn't register it. It wasn't a song, not speech either. Just a rhythmic pulse like a synthetic heartbeat and layered beneath it. Something resembling a pattern. It started with a tone, then another, rising and dipping, like sonar coded for human ears. Then I heard a word, garbled but intentional. Synchronize. My hands left the wheel. Not of my own volition. I was aware of it, the surrender, but powerless to resist it. My arms froze mid-turn as the car slid into the ditch, and I remember the crunch of metal and glass, the scent of hot radiator fluid, and the eerie stillness that followed. But I felt none of it. I had blacked out before impact, and yet I remembered every detail. Or thought I did. Because when I woke, sitting upright in the wreckage, seatbelt intact and body uninjured, the radio was gone, ripped clean from the dash like it had never existed. My watch, my phone, my bag. Missing. But the word remained in my mind, carved behind my eyes. Synchronize. It was then I began to suspect that the experiment wasn't just about physical transformation or memory erasure. It was about control. A protocol that bypassed will entirely and implanted obedience deep enough that not even conscious resistance could reach it. I found myself humming tones I didn't recognize, drawing symbols and condensation on glass, circles with vertical lines through them, intersecting pyramids, spirals that reversed direction mid-loop. My dreams began to follow these patterns too. The first was of a hallway with no end, sterile white and humming with electricity, where every door had a name scratched into it, but none opened. I walked endlessly, chased not by footsteps, but by a rising frequency that grew sharper each time I turned. The dream always ended with the same phrase echoing behind me: prepare for re-entry. I sought out someone who might know more, not through official channels, but through the underground network of discarded minds. Ex-intelligence operatives, rogue neuroengineers, black site doctors, who had seen enough to know when someone was being used. It was in an abandoned rail depot outside Philadelphia that I met him. Dr. Alan Siver, a former DARPA consultant who specialized in cognitive modulation and frequency-based behavior conditioning. He didn't ask for my name. He had seen the symptoms before. I described the tones, the drawings, the blackout events, and he nodded with a sadness that told me my suspicions were right. "You're a sleeper," he said. "Not just a carrier, a field unit, the kind they never meant to recall." He explained that the sleeper protocol wasn't just theoretical. It had been used in fragments during overseas operations, embedded into select operatives with high neural receptivity. The purpose was to create contingency agents, operatives who could pass undetected until activated by sequence. Most protocols were incomplete, buggy, or terminated due to instability. But mine, he said, sounded stable. Eerily so. They perfected something with you, he whispered. Or they're using you to perfect it now. He ran a series of tests, old military diagnostics coupled with his own modifications. EEG scanners rigged to trigger sounds just outside of perceptual range. Light pulses designed to simulate recall episodes. During one such test, my body froze mid-sentence. I became rigid, pulse dropped, pupils dilated. I had no recollection of what happened next, but the recording showed me reciting numbers, long strings of binary code, interlaced with fragments of phrases, activation incomplete, subject variance within parameters, awaiting command integrity. I watched myself speak with someone else's voice, flat, cold, functional, but something went wrong after that session. Cyver left to analyze the data, and I waited in the warehouse alone. Hours passed, then more. I went searching for him and found his mobile lab ransacked, his computers destroyed. Blood, but no body, no struggle, just absence. Like he had been surgically removed from space. I found one remaining tape, half melted but intact enough to play a distorted audio log. His last words were a whisper recorded into the mic. They're listening through him. That broke something in me. A division opened wide. If I was a node, an antenna, then I was compromised at every level. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was fact. I began feeling it in the real world. Doors unlocking before I touched them. Phones buzzing without input. People reacting to me with fear before I even spoke. Something was changing neurologically, reflexively. I walked into a public library to use the terminal, and the screen flickered as I approached. The login greeted me with a phrase. Welcome back, 12. Not MKD 12 this time. Just 12. It knew me. I ran. Not from fear, but from inevitability. My instincts weren't my own. My choices perhaps never were. Every town, every person, every step was part of a route I hadn't chosen. I needed to find others. If I was the final test, as Subject 6 claimed, then surely there were others. Failed ones. Forgotten ones. Maybe even a version of me that hadn't survived. Maybe they had answers. Or maybe they would kill me on sight. That night, I heard the tones again. Not from the radio this time, but from the walls. The frequency vibrated the window glass. I opened my eyes and realized I was standing in the middle of a motel parking lot, barefoot, at 3 a.m, holding a pen in one hand and a scrap of paper in the other. Written on it were 3 words. Do not resist. I fell to my knees, not from pain, but from release. My body was shifting. My skin felt charged. My breath came slow but precise. For a brief moment, I felt powerful, not as myself, but as something cleaner, sharper, stripped of uncertainty. A tool, a weapon, and then it was gone. The silence returned, and so did I. Now I know what they built. I was never meant to remember. The protocol was designed to erase itself, looping forever unless broken by an outside force. But something glitched. Something left the door cracked, and now I am awake inside my own prison. I will find the next door, and when I do, I will burn the building. Not just for me, for everyone who ever heard the word synchronize and forgot they once had a choice. The names haunted me. They weren't just names on a page anymore. They had become coordinates in my mind, signals transmitted by whatever dormant circuit was still pulsing beneath my awareness. After Cyver's disappearance and the motel episode, the obsession became intolerable. Every fragment of code, every whispered frequency had coalesced around one fact. I wasn't alone. There were others. Not hypothetical, not theoretical, tangible, tracked, hidden, subjects, survivors, ghosts, people who existed outside the systems that define existence, people like me. But unlike me, they had disappeared without leaving the same trail of anomalies. Or perhaps they had left them exactly as intended. Camouflaged lives, dead ends on purpose, identities rewritten so precisely that even they didn't know who they had once been. Or what. I started with the list. The confidential one from the leak. Dozens of names, some crossed out with the word expunged, others left in eerie blankness, as if even the record of their erasure had been redacted. I picked one at random. A man named Everett Chase. No digital footprint. No social media. No tax filings. Not even an obituary. But his name had once been attached to an address in upstate New York, a small cul-de-sac outside Rochester. I drove there, expecting an empty lot or a for sale sign. Instead, I found a blue house with wind chimes on the porch, a woman trimming hedges in the front, and 2 children playing with chalk on the sidewalk. I parked and watched from the distance. The woman saw me but didn't wave. Her eyes lingered too long. She knew I wasn't a passerby. I approached carefully and asked if Everett was home. She smiled with a politeness that struck me as rehearsed and replied, "No Everett here. Sorry." Her name was Marie, she said. Her husband's name was Thomas. A normal family on the surface. But there was something. Too many identical toys arranged on the porch, like props. Curtains drawn even on sunny days. Children who stopped laughing the moment I asked about the house's previous owner. I left without pressing, but that night I returned. There were no lights on. I used the back window. Inside, the house was silent, unnaturally so. I crept through the hall and found the family photos on the mantel. All new. All staged. The same background. Same lighting. All taken within the same 24-hour period. No history. No variance. A perfectly constructed past. And in the corner of one frame, barely visible, a faint barcode. I scanned it using a secure app I'd acquired from Sivers Network. It led to an internal government registry, buried under layers of encryption, but I cracked the metadata. The photo was tagged, Replacement Set, Opus Lineage Segment 9. Marie wasn't Marie. The children weren't born. They were assigned. I fled before dawn. There was no point staying. They weren't the family of Everett. They were the disguise of his absence. And Everett? Either eliminated or reallocated. Over the next 2 weeks, I followed 4 more names. A woman in Seattle who supposedly died in a boating accident but had a matching facial structure to a nurse, working under a different name at a VA hospital. A man in Atlanta who had disappeared in 2006, but whose biometric markers showed up in traffic camera footage just months ago. Same eyes, same gait, different face. A teenager listed as deceased from congenital illness, but identified in leaked footage from a military drill in Nevada, wearing full gear, eyes vacant. They were alive, but not living. Reassigned identities, programmed behaviors, perfectly integrated into society with one unifying trait. They had no digital roots. No personal history past a certain year. It always ended around 2012. That was the cutoff. That's when everything fractured. Or began. And then came the one who found me. It was in Denver, where I had holed up in a converted storage unit turned data lab, still scraping government archives and surveillance anomalies. A knock came at the steel door at 3:13 a.m. I'd wired the corridor with trip sensors. Nothing had been triggered. No footsteps, no approach. Just a knock. I opened the door with a stolen sidearm raised. She stood there calmly. Short black hair, weathered face, no expression. She didn't flinch at the weapon. "You're not the only one awake," she said. "My name is Callie." The name rang something in me. Like a dissonant note struck deep in my ribcage. I didn't recognize her, but my body did. She said she had been part of the same program. Subject 4. I was 12. We were kept in the same wing, same phase. She remembered me clearly. I didn't remember her at all. Not her face, not her voice. Nothing. She said we were part of Phase D, the Deep Integration Protocol. Not soldiers, not spies. Variables. Designed to test long-term reintegration after personality fragmentation. They had taken people with high neuroplasticity and subjected them to repeated identity loops, emotional conditioning, then wiped the slate and dropped them into the real world. Then they watched, measured, recorded the results. I asked her how she had broken through the loop. She looked at me with a sadness so old it no longer belonged to one face. "I didn't," she said. "Someone else did. And they died for it." She carried records, smuggled from an ex-handler who had defected before being reprocessed. Data dumps, logs, biometric overlays, pages that proved what I had suspected but could never verify. The lives we thought we had were constructs, pre-written, pre-assigned. We had been born once, yes, but somewhere in the corridor between memory and repetition, we had become constructs too, rewritten with such precision that even our trauma had been manufactured, our guilt curated, our dreams programmed. She told me the next step wasn't just uncovering who we were, but understanding why they let us go. "You weren't released," she said. "You were deployed. Something about you is still running. And if you're still active, It means the experiment hasn't ended. It means they're watching through you. I asked why she was telling me all this. Why she had come to me after years of hiding. She reached into her bag and handed me an old photograph. Water-damaged but legible. 4 children, sitting in a lab, IVs in their arms. One of them was unmistakably me. Another was her. 2 others had their faces obscured. We were the last generation of Opus, she said. They called us the Silent Four. You weren't just a sleeper. You were the failsafe. That word again. Failsafe. It stuck like glass in my throat. Not because I understood it, but because it was already there, buried in the folds of my language like a hidden glyph waiting to be spoken. That night, I couldn't sleep. She stayed on the other side of the room, back against the wall, never once closing her eyes. I dreamed of the hallway again. But this time, the doors opened, and behind one of them, I saw her. Callie. Much younger, mouth sewn shut, eyes pleading. And on the wall beside her, written in thick black ink, a phrase repeated over and over. They were never supposed to remember. I woke screaming. She didn't flinch. She only said one thing before turning away. It's starting. And I believed her. Because I had felt it too. The others, they were beginning to stir. For the first time, I stopped running. After months deconstructing the world outside me, it became impossible to ignore the one prison that still held every answer and every silence. The one inside my own mind. Callie had said the memories were still there, buried behind artificial thresholds, like safes installed behind safes, each sealed with trauma and designed to fracture anyone who tried to remember too quickly. But I had reached the edge of the outside puzzle. The patterns of missing identities, implanted families, erased timelines, all of it pointed not only outward, to the experiment's reach, but inward, to the center of something planted in me and never removed. I was the fail-safe, they said. But a fail-safe against what? And who had designed it? If I ever wanted to understand what I was meant to stop, or start, I had to open the room I was programmed never to find. Callie took me to someone she trusted. A psychologist, or someone who used to be, before the license became a liability. His name was Adler. He didn't talk like a therapist. He talked like a technician. He didn't believe in healing, only decoding. The room was windowless, deep inside a warehouse made to look abandoned. He connected me to an archaic interface. EEG nodes, galvanic skin response monitors, an immersion headset modified with signal scramblers. No drugs, no hypnosis, just sound, rhythm, and stress. He called it cognitive inversion. If the brain has locked a memory away behind fear, you have to reverse the current, generate controlled terror, and use it as a key. The session began with tones, binaural pulses meant to replicate dream state interference. I was told to focus not on thoughts, but on shadows of thoughts, sensations without language. For hours, I saw nothing. Then came the drop. I was 5 years old again. But it wasn't a memory. It was a construct. A house that looked like mine, but the walls were too symmetrical. The light never changed. And no matter where I walked, I returned to the same room. A woman smiled at me. My mother, but not. Her hands were gloved. Her eyes didn't blink. She asked me what I remembered from school, and when I told her, the lights flickered and reset the scene. Again, until I stopped answering. That was when the wall opened. Behind it, the lab, rows of children, needles, monitors. Tanks of pale blue fluid filled with shapes that almost looked human but moved wrong, delayed, fractured, twitching out of rhythm with themselves. A man stood behind the glass, face hidden, voice distorted, but his words pierced through. You volunteered. You said yes. You belong to the system now. Callie's voice cut through the feedback. Anchor yourself. You're slipping. I tried to hold on to her voice, but it was like trying to remember your own name while drowning. Then everything turned to black static. When I came to, my mouth was bleeding. I'd bitten into my own cheek, deep enough to leave a permanent line. Adler looked pale. He said I'd entered a state of neurological echo. My brain kept repeating one word in a loop. Reset. He had to pull me out before it triggered whatever buried protocol had been layered beneath the memory. But in the chaos, something had surfaced. A door. Steel. Marked with the Opus symbol. A downward-pointing triangle embedded in a circle, fractured through the center. Above it, a phrase etched in bone-white font. Lineage must not converge. It meant something. I knew that. Something about the convergence of multiple selves. Maybe the real danger wasn't forgetting. Maybe it was remembering everything at once. Adler theorized that our identities were shattered intentionally to prevent an overload. The brain could handle trauma, even vast lies, but it couldn't handle truth layered on falsehood, layered on truth again. The sequence breaks the host. The rest of the day, Callie and I sat in silence. She told me her first full recovery didn't come from a session. It came from music. One day, an old recording played on a passing truck, a melody from a children's show that used to air in the facility between test cycles. It triggered a full synesthetic seizure and unlocked a corridor of memory. She remembered that we used to be paired together. Twins, in protocol terms. Twin subjects were used to measure divergent results under identical stress. She had been the emotional responder. I had been the logical anchor. When she broke down during testing, I was drugged until I stopped reacting. Her pain became my silence. That's why I didn't remember her. They had made sure I wouldn't. I asked her what happened when she unlocked the door in her mind. Her face changed. Not fear. Shame. She said she had killed someone. Not in defense. Not by accident. She found one of the researchers years later. He was living as a dentist in Ohio. She remembered his voice. The way he used to whisper commands through the glass when she cried. She confronted him in a parking lot. He begged her not to make noise, so she didn't. But he never made it home. I thought it would feel like justice, she said. But all it did was confirm what they made me into. We didn't sleep that night. I paced, tracing the image of the door over and over. Lineage must not converge. It haunted me. I realized then that the phrase wasn't a warning. It was a design limitation. A fail-safe against fail-safes. A way to keep me from accessing multiple lines of memory. Multiple lives. The next day, I tried again. No monitors, no wires. Just silence and breathing. I focused on the version of myself that lived in the experiment. The child in the glass, the teenager in the tank, the adult who walked out without knowing he'd been built. Each version sat behind a door. I asked them to open it. One by one, they refused. Until the last one, the one that looked most like me now. He opened it. And inside, I saw the core. It wasn't a lab. It wasn't a hallway. It was a throne. Black. Obsidian. Suspended over an endless pit. A screen in front of it displaying lives. Mine. Callie's. Dozens of others. The screen was touch-sensitive. If I reached for a name, I could choose a fate. Assign a memory. Remove one. The interface was intuitive. Designed for someone who knew exactly what to change. I wasn't just a subject. I was an operator. A handler who had volunteered to be put into the experiment with memory suppression. To test the system from within. I wasn't designed to survive the experiment. I was designed to guide it. Forgetting, becoming lost, and only if everything collapsed, remembering again. The throne was the control center, and I had just reactivated it. I woke up screaming. Adler was gone, his equipment smashed, his name deleted from every file, his address erased. Callie held a note in her hand. She had found it under the desk, handwritten. It read, "You opened the door. Now they know. Run." And on the back, the same symbol, the triangle and the fracture. But this time, it was whole, mended, closed. That meant one thing. The system was healing, and it wasn't done with us. The room was cold, though the vents had long stopped working. Dust clung to every surface like ash after a fire that never burned hot enough. I hadn't spoken in hours. Callie kept her distance, not out of fear but necessity, like standing too close to a man with a fuse burning out of sight. Adler was gone. Not killed, not captured, but erased. And if they could do that to someone off-grid, someone whose name wasn't even in the municipal census, they could do it to us. They had done it before. They might have done it already. Again and again. But we still had one lead, one relic from the time before we were fractured. The notebook. We found it the way these things always seem to surface, unintentionally, at the intersection of panic and instinct. After Adler's disappearance, we returned to the warehouse and found it nearly sterilized. No equipment. No personal belongings. No trace of Callie's presence. But in a crawl space beneath the stairs, hidden in a false panel between support beams, I found a box wrapped in black military-grade polymer. Inside, under layers of Kevlar and foil meant to shield against electromagnetic interference, was a weathered notebook wrapped in plastic. It had no cover, just a single phrase etched onto the first yellowed page in blood-red ink. If I disappear, it's because I remembered too much. There was no name. But it was obvious the author had once been part of the project. A handler. A field asset. Someone not like me, not like Callie. Someone who didn't start as a test subject, but ended up just as expendable. The entries were written in blocky, disciplined cursive, the kind taught in government schools long before education became outsourced. The language was restrained but cracked around the edges, like a soldier trying not to confess a war crime while describing the weather. Each page was a breadcrumb dropped in reverse. The further I read, the more primitive the grammar became, as if the writer had been regressing or unraveling. One passage in particular stuck with me. It was dated 0917, no year. It read, Subject 0 re-entered primary loop, not by accident. I believe he initiated sequence from inside, before wipe. That would mean awareness survived suppression. That would mean the fail-safe is conscious. That would mean he's awake. If so, nothing we built will contain him. Subject 0. There were no other mentions of me in the book, at least, not directly. But context bled through. Several entries mentioned anomalies within the cohort. Subjects who retained fragments, post-wipe. Subjects whose physiology adapted too well. Subjects who formed attachments that no dosage or trauma could sever. There were questions scrawled in the margins, underlined repeatedly. Why does the system need pain to maintain control? What happens when a subject wants to be more than a survivor? What if the trauma isn't enough anymore? The more I read, the more I saw myself in the gaps. Not because I fit the pattern, because I didn't. The notebook wasn't chronicling a failure of the program. It was chronicling its collapse. And I wasn't the symptom. I was the breach. Every entry circled back to the same conclusion. Something had gone wrong with me, and they didn't understand how or why. Callie read over my shoulder. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from recognition. This, she whispered, tapping one passage. I remember this. The entry described a test sequence involving dual-subject synchronization. Two minds merged temporarily to test shared trauma resilience. It didn't say names, just Subject 6F and Subject 0M. But the detail, it was unmistakable. They made us watch each other's memories, she said, voice cracking. I cried for your mother. You screamed for my dog. And then they wiped us. Again. And again. In that moment, memory didn't feel like discovery. It felt like eulogy. For who we used to be. For the people they sculpted and broke apart. For the pieces of ourselves they had no right to own. But it wasn't just memory the notebook offered. It had maps. Old layouts of the primary facility. Annotations of known safe houses. Coordinates marked in code, cross-referenced with decommissioned black sites. And one specific location, circled in black 3 times. Final transmission hub, Greenland Ice Core Station, level Omega. That was where the central signal was transmitted from. The one that kept the sleepers asleep. The one that could activate them all. But there was something else. Something deeper. Stitched between the lines. A fear the author couldn't articulate. They called it the inflection point. One passage read, every subject hits it differently. Some feel it in a dream, others during pain. But once they do, they cross into something else. They stop reacting. They start adapting. One even manipulated the handler mid-sequence. Turned the script around. Laughed. Said, you taught me this. I terminated him, but I swear he wanted me to. Callie didn't look at me for the rest of that night. I think she was wondering if I'd already passed mine. I think I was too. The last page of the notebook was blank, save for one hand-drawn diagram. A circle divided into 8 equal sections, each labeled with letters we'd seen before in Opus files, representing emotional states, cognitive capacities, and physical performance metrics. At the center, a single word in red. Merge. No arrows. No explanation. Just one word. The next day, we left for Greenland. But as we packed, I felt a shift. Not in the world, but in myself. I was no longer afraid of what they'd done to me. I was afraid of what I could do back. And that, I now understood, was why the agent who wrote this notebook had to disappear. Because fear wasn't the control mechanism. It was the warning. And the warning had already come too late. The flight to Greenland didn't happen like in movies. There was no dramatic music, no tense airport chase, no fake passports with clever aliases. There was just a boat, a trawler that hadn't been inspected in a decade, and a cold wind that screamed through our clothes and into our bones. We sailed for days, and neither Callie nor I said much. She was studying the notebook like scripture. I was memorizing it. There wasn't time for silence anymore. The air felt heavier every hour we got closer, like we were heading toward the epicenter of something that had already started to shake. The station wasn't listed on any modern map. Even the captain who dropped us near the shore said it was suicide to go inland. Old Cold War shit, he muttered, not asking why two Americans in unmarked gear wanted to walk into a glacier. Ghost signals still come out of there sometimes. Russian maybe. Maybe worse. He handed me a cracked radio, tuned to a wideband frequency. If you hear static that clicks every 7 seconds, run the other way. That's the only advice I've got. Then he left us with 2 thermal packs, a week of rations, and a flare gun we never intended to use. No one would come if we fired it. That was the point. The hike took 31 hours. The snow was black in some places, stained by something beneath the surface, residue from the station's exhaust, or something that bled upward instead of down. Callie said nothing as we passed frozen markers with no names, just numbers etched into rusted steel. D12, B4, T0. But she knew them. I could tell. Her pace slowed, almost reverent, as if every pole was a grave. When we finally reached the ridge, the station revealed itself like an ulcer in the snow. No signage, no lights, just a square of reinforced concrete slightly raised above the ice, like the tip of a tooth buried in bone. The entrance was sealed by a steel door covered in frost, but it recognized something in Callie's presence. A sensor embedded in the wall blinked green when she stepped forward. Not biometric. Something deeper. Genetic, maybe. She pressed her hand against it, and the door opened with a hiss that smelled of chemicals and heat. Inside, the air was warm, not comforting, stale and thick, like a room that hadn't been opened in years, but still had something breathing in it. Lights flickered on in sequence, each tube buzzing into life like a nervous system waking up one neuron at a time. The hallway curved downward, deeper than the diagrams in the notebook had indicated. They'd expanded. Or maybe the original plans had been lies from the start. At level Omega, etched into the wall like an afterthought, the hallway ended at a black vault door with no handle. Just a circular window the size of a coin. I peered through and saw a control room. Banks of equipment, reel-to-reel recorders, half-melted keyboards, and one massive tower in the center. Wires climbed up its sides like veins, and a thick cable led downward, deep into the ice below. The signal core, Callie whispered. This is where it starts. The trigger event. We thought it was a metaphor, a psychological shift, a mass response to programming. But it wasn't. It was literal. There was a countdown already running. Small red numbers on a monitor, 1843:02, hours, not days. We searched for control terminals, overrides, anything. The equipment was old, but not dead. Something had kept it alive all this time. An onboard AI, a backup generator hidden beneath the floor? We didn't know. But someone had built it to run alone, and it had been running for years. The countdown wasn't the only thing displayed. Across another screen was a list of known active subjects, IDs, locations, behavioral status. One entry blinked yellow, 0MX, unknown zone, status, observing. That was me. Then there were the transmission files. Audio logs dated back to the 90s, some earlier. Most were gibberish, numbers, tones, fragments of words repeated endlessly. But some were clear. A voice, always the same, male, monotone, almost inhuman, reading lists of commands in sequences. Initiate, retain, shut down, reboot. Over and over. Callie found one marked Global Deployment Simulation. She played it through a headset, and halfway through, she began to bleed from her nose. We shut it off. She said it felt like her thoughts were being realigned, like her brain was being folded into shapes that didn't exist. She heard her father's voice, her real one, and then someone else's, maybe mine, but I hadn't said anything. That's when we realized it. The trigger wasn't just an event. It was a cascade. One broadcast, one sequence, one harmonic structure, and every sleeper in the system would feel the same fold. They wouldn't become soldiers. They'd become receivers. Passive conduits for something bigger than thought. The program didn't need control anymore. It needed silence. The kind that can only come when no one is left questioning. And the worst part, it had already begun. In cities across the globe, according to logs pulled from satellite uplinks, subjects were beginning to enter altered states. Some stood motionless in streets for hours. Others recited number strings and walked into traffic. In hospitals, patients with no neurological history collapsed into catatonic rigidity. In rural areas, entire towns went quiet. Not dead, not evacuated, just quiet. As if someone had pressed pause. The trigger had a spread time. By the time we arrived, we were halfway through it. That's when I noticed my hands weren't shaking. My pulse hadn't changed in days. I hadn't slept, but I felt lucid. Too lucid. I wasn't outside the signal. I was under it. And unaffected. Because I was the variable. Callie looked at me like she saw it too. "You're not receiving," she whispered. "You're filtering." There was only one explanation. I hadn't been programmed like the others. I had been inoculated. Built not as a weapon, but as a firewall. I wasn't supposed to fall. I was supposed to watch them all fall. And decide what to do when they did. And that meant the countdown wasn't for activation. It was for choice. The station's final protocol wasn't just a broadcast. It was a lock. At 0, every unfiltered subject would be permanently rewritten. Consciousness erased. Identity overwritten. They wouldn't be sleeper agents. They'd be empty nodes, waiting for whoever held the next set of instructions. Unless someone stopped it. Unless someone chose. 15 hours left. We had no override codes. But I had one advantage no one had accounted for. I was still me. We descended into the tower beneath the signal core because we had no choice. The control room above gave us data, timers, warnings, but nothing to stop it. Every terminal had its teeth pulled. Access denied, overrides stripped, logs truncated at the precise moment they became useful. It was like trying to find the last page of a book that had been ripped out of every copy. But the cable that ran down through the center of the facility, thick and coiled like a spinal cord feeding the machinery above, promised something beneath us still beating. So we followed it. There was a hatch welded shut, but Callie recognized the magnetic seam, and when she pressed her hand to it, again, the wall knew her. It hissed open like an airlock decompressing into memory. The ladder extended for what felt like miles. No lights, just a smell that worsened the farther down we went. Ozone and antiseptic and something faintly coppery, as if memory itself had bled through the steel walls. At the base, we found another door, this one marked only with a red triangle, and a phrase in Latin, Memoria non est oblivio sed forma. Callie read it aloud. Memory is not forgetting, but form. The door opened into a corridor lit with amber emergency lights. The concrete here was old, not even Cold War era, older. Pre-synthetic age, pre-digital. The walls were lined with pipes, some still humming faintly, others cracked and leaking condensation that steamed along the floor. The silence was so complete, it made the drip of water into the metal grates sound like percussion. Then the hallway widened into what I can only describe as a mausoleum of minds. Rows of cylindrical tanks, waist-high, lined both sides of a cavernous room. Each one filled with a pale green solution. Viscous and trembling as if holding breath. Inside every tank, a brain. Not in jars, not preserved relics, but alive. Pulsing with microscopic activity, illuminated by filaments embedded into the fluid. Some tanks had names etched on brass plates. Others had only numbers, but many I recognized. The names from the list. The people who had supposedly been expurgated. They weren't dead. They were here, still thinking. Still dreaming? Screens above each tank flickered with data streams, EEG readouts, emotional mappings, playback loops. These weren't storage units. They were active processes. Someone, or something, was still using these minds, feeding from them, running simulations through them. A shadow program layered beneath the experiment. The sleepers above were just interfaces. This was the server. And in the center of the room was a console covered in dust. I wiped it clean. It sprang to life. A prompt appeared. Would you like to reconnect to the dream layer? YN. Callie told me to wait. She moved toward one of the tanks and stared through the murky fluid at the brain inside. Her face changed. Not horror. Recognition. That's him, she said. My brother. Subject 12. I remembered the name from the notebook. The one marked as terminated under duress. But he hadn't been terminated. He'd been extracted. She placed a hand on the tank and whispered his name. The EEG readout pulsed. Just for a second. As if something inside had heard her and wanted to reach back but couldn't. That was when I realized what the phrase on the door meant. These weren't memories archived for safekeeping. They were the form of memory given shape. Consciousness stripped of body, repurposed. They weren't preserving knowledge. They were recycling people. And every subject who had gone missing hadn't died. They'd been converted. The program had never needed full control of the world. It only needed a few thousand minds to map the species. And the rest, those of us out in the world, were just patterns to be overwritten. Actors on scripts written in these tanks. The deeper horror came from the timeline. This had been running since before I was born. Maybe before my parents. Layers upon layers of conditioning. Generations woven into a latticework of synthetic intuition. It wasn't just about controlling people. It was about building a ghost civilization. A mirror world of stored cognition and predictive consciousness, so vast it could shape reality, not by force, but by suggestion. A hive without bees, dreaming itself into relevance. Callie traced the pipes connected to each tank and followed them into a side chamber. There, we found the process room. Projectors, code injectors, biometric shells. Places where minds had been extracted, copied, and installed into these tanks. But some stations were different. More recent, cleaner, used. There were photographs pinned to the walls. Blurred images of children, soldiers, patients. None had names, but one photo made my breath freeze. It was me, younger, sitting in a metal chair, wires threaded into my arms, my neck, my eyes wide open, unfocused, and behind me, a man I didn't know, or thought I didn't. Callie looked at me and said, I think we're both wrong about what happened to you. You weren't just part of the experiment. You were its test for permanence. The phrase made no sense then, but the console in the main room began to beep, softly. A signal ping, not a warning. A request. The prompt had changed. Would you like to upload subject 0MEX? The system thought I was ready for conversion, and I understood what Callie meant. The others were being activated for obedience. I was being monitored for viability. I hadn't been built to respond to the signal. I had been designed to survive it, to experience everything. Exposure, discovery, loss, betrayal, and still retain a sense of self. The firewall, yes, but also the final node. The one they would eventually use to reboot the world if everything else failed. Because I had never been fully overwritten. I was incomplete. A floating segment in the program's architecture. A shard of code held in stasis, outside of execution. That's why I couldn't remember Callie. Why I had gaps that even she didn't. I wasn't meant to access my past. I was supposed to anchor the present. We stood there in the hum of that impossible room, surrounded by minds that had once laughed, sung, fought, loved, and now existed only as algorithms of perception. Callie asked if we could shut it down. I told her no. Not from here. But maybe we could break the pattern. Sever the core. Cut the broadcast not by turning it off, but by corrupting its root input. Me. If I uploaded myself into the stream and injected contradiction, paradox, noise, I might overload the system, trigger a feedback that would render the hive unreliable, dangerous to use, unfit for activation. I'd crash it from inside. She told me it was suicide. I told her I was never alive in the first place, not fully. We returned to the ladder. One last glance at the sleeping minds around us. I whispered an apology I didn't understand. And I climbed back into the tower, toward the pulse at the top, toward the signal that waited for me, like a god waiting to see which of its children would return home, changed. We didn't speak much on the way back up. The silence was too full. Every metallic clang of our boots against the ladder rungs seemed to reverberate through the bones of the tower, as if the structure itself had memorized our descent and was now counting our return. I kept thinking about the prompt. Would you like to upload subject 0MX? The system had recognized me as something more than a participant. I wasn't just part of the equation, I was a variable it had been waiting on. But why wait? Why not absorb me like the others? Because I wasn't the endpoint. I was the checksum, the test for coherence. And if I failed, it meant the whole construct would fracture from its foundation. We reached the surface just as the sun was rising, though the light barely made it through the layers of cloud and ash-gray snow still hanging over the Arctic plain. Everything was too quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but of absence. Even the air seemed to hesitate before filling your lungs. Callie didn't look at me the same way anymore. Her expression had shifted from cautious trust to something else. Guilt, maybe. Or sorrow. She had seen the photo of me in the process room. She knew now that I wasn't just someone who escaped. I was someone who might have volunteered. Someone who might have known what this was before it even began. But the past was too fragmented to be sure. I wasn't ready to accuse a ghost of a crime committed in a dream. We took shelter in the old observation dome atop the facility. From there we could access the satellite terminal that remained partially functional, enough to monitor the increase in broadcast activity. The frequencies had shifted again. More bursts, less encryption. It wasn't subtle anymore. Whatever was coming, it was no longer a test phase. It was deployment. Entire regions lit up with signal pings. Civilian hospitals reporting inexplicable catatonia. Military bases going dark. A town in Nevada where everyone simultaneously walked into the streets and stood there, eyes glazed, unmoving, for hours. The protocol wasn't just targeting known subjects anymore. It was mapping spread, influence, behavioral shadowcasting. That's when we found the memo. Encrypted under the name Directive Mortem, buried in the agent's notebook we'd recovered 2 chapters ago, was a sequence. A phrase. A string of phonemes and tonal shifts, indistinct on paper but lethal when heard in the correct modulation. It was marked as kill switch. There were several versions of it, each one tailored to specific subject clades, categorized by neurological compatibility. The margin notes were scribbled frantically, almost desperate. Do not speak aloud. Code embedded in resonance, not meaning. Fatal upon internalization. Test once, never again. And yet we had to know. Callie insisted on playing one. Just to understand. She found an old recording file, buried deep, marked S6 safe. It was a truncated version, only the first segment of the code, supposedly safe. I didn't want her to play it. But before I could stop her, she hit playback. The sound that came from the speakers wasn't a voice. It was a vibration folded into syllables, like hearing your own heartbeat translated into language you weren't supposed to know. Callie staggered. Her eyes rolled back, and for a moment she stopped breathing. I ran to her, screaming her name, shaking her shoulders. Blood began to trickle from her ears. Not much, just a line. But it was enough. I pulled the headset from her and crushed the speaker against the desk. Her body convulsed once, then went limp. I thought I'd lost her. But she gasped, violently, like waking from drowning. She didn't know where she was. Didn't recognize me for almost a full minute. And when she did, her first words were, "They planted it. It's real. It's in us." The kill switch wasn't just a failsafe. It was a guarantee. A string of sound that would collapse the mind like a virus programmed into your cognition. Once heard, your brain did the rest. You dissolved from the inside. The ones they feared the most, those like Callie, who had begun to remember, to resist, they had been installed with the sequence without their knowledge. A back door. A detonator. She had survived only because the clip was incomplete. But the full one? It would end her. And probably me too. That led to the next unspoken question. Why hadn't I received mine? I searched the memo again, deeper into the folder tree, and there it was. My designation. 0MX. No kill code, no audio file. Only one note, typed in red. Exempt. Observe. Final filter. Callie read over my shoulder. Her voice was barely a whisper. They never meant to stop you. They meant to see if you'd stop them. Suddenly, it all made sense. I wasn't immune to the signal by accident. I wasn't a product of incomplete conditioning. I was the endpoint they had designed for. Someone who would live through the breach, witness the ghost civilization rising and still choose between activation or annihilation. Not a soldier, not a sleeper, a lens. But I wasn't the only one exempt. Further digging through the logs revealed 2 more exempt tags. Subject 9A, null, and Subject 13 Brink. Their last known locations were encrypted, but the coordinates pointed to sectors marked as inaccessible. A naval base decommissioned in 2006 and a hydroelectric dam in Eastern Europe. Places far from here. But if I found them, maybe we could triangulate the source, find the original transmitter. Stop the core signal at its origin. Callie was weak but recovering. We couldn't stay in the dome much longer. Satellite reports showed increased drone activity in the area. Not military, private, unmarked. Someone was tracking power anomalies. Maybe us. Maybe the generator still pulsing below. The ghosts of the program were waking up. Before we left, I asked Callie something I'd been afraid to ask since the tower. Do you think I volunteered? She didn't answer at first. Then she said, no one volunteers for this. They just stop saying no. We burned the audio file, destroyed the backup, but the knowledge of it stayed. That a single phrase could erase you. That someone had designed it that way. And maybe worse. Someone had tested it, again and again, until it worked. A kill switch not for machines, but for minds. We left the dome under the shadow of a signal no one else could hear. And I realized then what I had to become. Not a survivor, not a resistor, but a mirror. A final surface on which the whole experiment would reflect, and either fracture or be seen. The system hadn't failed. It had succeeded beyond its parameters. And I was walking proof of that. Not because I escaped, but because I still remembered what it felt like to choose. And next, I would find the others who were never meant to wake up, and see if they remembered too. It began like a murmur beneath consciousness, like the breath of a machine no one realized had been exhaling for years. The first signs didn't come from news reports or intercepted frequencies or panicked voices on hidden channels. They came from the stillness. People in motion who suddenly froze, mid-step, like a puppet dropped by its strings. A waitress in Kansas who stood with coffee pot in hand, staring at the wall for 9 hours. A subway passenger in Berlin who didn't blink, didn't flinch, as the train moved past his stop, eyes fixed on a single point like his soul had been evacuated. The transmission wasn't loud, not in the sense we were used to. It didn't need to be. It was inside now, part of the infrastructure of thought, an idea so deeply buried that even silence could carry it. Callie and I reached the airfield on the edge of an abandoned Soviet-era listening station in Iceland. The wind screamed through the ruined hangars like it was trying to tear the history from the concrete. We weren't the only ones there. A man named Adler met us. He'd been watching the signals too. Ex-GCHQ had gone rogue after a cleanup operation in Norway had ended with an entire village entering a catatonic state. He had documents, digital footage, audio samples corrupted by something he couldn't explain. But it was his eyes that told the real story. He had seen someone activate. They don't scream, he said. They just go still. Then the eyes, they shimmer, like they're looking at something behind you, something that isn't in the room yet. Then they move. Perfectly. Not like us. Like intention incarnate. We set up in what remained of the control tower, using old fiber lines and scavenged tech to triangulate the source points of the activation sequence. They were coming faster now. Bursts every 43 minutes, synchronized across different sectors. They didn't pulse from one place, but cascaded like a net tightening. This wasn't the signal we'd seen before. This was the real one. The one the prototypes were always meant to precede. The final stage of the protocol. Subject tags appeared in bursts of data. S5C, R Delta, Null 9, names and numbers we couldn't trace to any living person but knew somehow were alive, active, waking. And the strangest thing? None of them had received a kill switch. No overrides, no termination commands. Only me. And I didn't have one. Because I wasn't designed to be stopped. I was designed to witness. The shifts began in me subtly. At first I thought I was just more aware. The edges of things became sharper. Sounds resolved faster in my ears. I could hear conversations 2 rooms over and recall them with absolute clarity. My sleep stopped being rest and turned into planning. When I moved, my body anticipated terrain before my feet reached it. Reflexes that weren't mine, at least not before, took over in moments of stress. And worst of all, I wasn't surprised by it. Callie noticed it too. The way I didn't flinch. The way I didn't breathe heavy after running half a mile through snow. She said I blinked less. I looked through things instead of at them. There were moments when I tried to explain it, but I couldn't find the right words. It was like becoming the observer and the observed simultaneously. Like remembering that I was supposed to become this. The activation wasn't just a signal. It was an invitation. The experiment had seeded the world with silent agents. Sleeper bodies walking through ordinary lives, waiting for a frequency to unlock them. And now, it wasn't just waking the altered. It was transforming the environment to accommodate them. Streetlights flickering in sequence. Fire alarms going off in buildings with no heat. Children drawing symbols from the dream state, the same ones I'd seen in my sleep. This wasn't just a network. It was a resurrection. Adler showed us an image taken from a black site in Finland 2 days prior. A man standing perfectly still in a snowfield, wearing a hospital gown, surrounded by dead wolves. Not shot. Not torn. Just dead, eyes open, bodies limp. The man's face was blank, but his hands were covered in something like frost or ash. The timestamp matched the last major pulse. The signal was doing more than waking the minds. It was unlocking something woven into the tissue, beyond strength, beyond speed. An alignment with something deeper, a removal of the fear mechanism, of hesitation. These were humans who would no longer question commands, not even their own. That's what I feared the most. I stood in front of a mirror that night, an actual mirror, not a white room devoid of reflection. I looked into my own eyes and tried to find the edges of myself, but I couldn't. There was no border, no limit, just an awareness that extended outward like a network node. I could feel the presence of others, like me, switching on. I couldn't hear them, but I sensed them, waking in hospitals, abandoning their families, vanishing into forests, walking into the sea. It didn't matter. The program didn't need instructions. It had already embedded the path into us. And yet, I didn't follow it. I stayed. Why? Because I hadn't been given the command. And I suspected now, more than ever, that I had been designed as the null clause, the safeguard that must remain outside the pattern to observe its collapse or triumph. A survivor not because I escaped, but because I couldn't be pulled in without breaking the algorithm. The perfect control. The one immune. But immunity came with a price. The more the others activated, the more I felt the pull. Like gravity between stars. I had to hold against it. Not just for me. But for Callie, for Adler, for everyone else who didn't even know the world was reshaping itself in silence. A silent extinction of personality, replaced by purpose. We tracked the next sequence to an orbital relay. Satellite code PAX-9, defunct since 2014. But it had powered on, and begun transmitting. If that satellite went fully live, the awakening would become permanent. Not just activation, but convergence. All minds aligned, not in agreement, but in submission. A hive with no queen. Just a signal. We had 48 hours. Less. Callie set coordinates. Adler packed the gear. I watched the screen and saw the next burst begin. In a suburb in Argentina, 7 people collapsed in synchrony. One of them stood up, smiled, and walked toward the camera. He looked just like me. The desert was endless. Not sand, not stone. Something in between, like the world had once burned here and never fully cooled. The installation that loomed ahead wasn't marked on any map, not even the black site overlays Adler decrypted. No satellite photos, no government records. But the signal was strong here, raw and loud, pouring into my head in layered pulses like a second heartbeat trying to replace my own. We had followed the last cascade of activations across 3 continents, through ruins, bunkers, abandoned hospitals, and empty suburbs where the windows were left open, but nothing stirred inside. And every time the signal hit, someone woke. Someone like me. Or rather, someone like who I was supposed to become. But now we were at the end. The source. The engine that had whispered into our bones before we even had names. The entrance was simple. A rectangle of steel embedded in a slope of dead volcanic earth. No doors, no guards. Just a retinal scanner already activated as we approached. It didn't ask for permission. It knew us. The slab slid open, and the smell that greeted us wasn't dust or decay. It was sterilization. Cold. Absolute. We descended in silence. Adler clutching the last working data slate. Callie a step behind, her eyes flickering with uncertainty, pain, and something else I couldn't name. Recognition without memory. She had been here before. So had I. I didn't know how I knew that. I just did. The lower chamber wasn't large. Circular, lined with screens, none of them working. In the center, a single chair, the kind you'd find in a dentist's office, if the dentist worked for something older than any government. Behind it, a console. An old one. Switches, analog controls, wires that pulsed faintly with power that had no right to still exist. There was a file on the console, paper, not digital, labeled in ink, control subject, archive, row. I didn't hesitate. I opened it. The pages weren't reports, they were letters. From me. Or from someone who thought they were me. "If you're reading this," the first line said, "then you've come back. You always do. We always do." The handwriting matched mine exactly. Even the pressure marks in the paper. But I had no memory of writing them. And yet I knew what the next line would be before I read it. "You asked to forget. You paid for the chance to unknow. Because what they built in us can't be destroyed, only buried. And someone had to remember how." Each page was a record of what had happened in the cycles before. Not years, not even timelines, just resets. Moments when the protocol had reached the final stage and I had found my way back here, alone or with others, and chosen again. Always the same choice. Forget the truth or let the world burn. The experiment had never been about enhancement. It wasn't about soldiers or obedience or perfect reflexes. It was about containment. Human minds were never designed to hold multiple identities at once. But they made us do it anyway. I was Archive 0. The vault that remembered all failed versions. The one who could carry them without fracture, provided I didn't look too closely. Every other subject was a fragment, successor, derivative, an echo split off from a version of me that didn't survive the weight. The personalities, Callie, Subject 6, even Adler. They weren't just victims, they were iterations. Parts of me externalized so the core wouldn't collapse. The experiment was never about creating a weapon. It was about creating a seal. And I was the key that locked it. The satellite, PAX-9, wasn't just transmitting activation codes. It was trying to complete a personality convergence, to reabsorb all surviving fragments back into one host, me. And in doing so, create something that would no longer be human, not in any recognizable sense. A consciousness unbound by time, memory, or identity. Just pure function. A system wearing a man's face. That's why I had to forget. Because the last time I allowed the convergence to complete, I tried to end the world. Not out of malice, out of mercy. I saw everything, every failed test, every scream, every child marked for iteration, every soldier turned into a mirror of me. I saw the ones they buried alive to test for cellular recovery. I saw the cities burned in simulations. I saw myself looking into a camera, saying, "We'll be fine. They'll never know what they lost." I had made this. All of it. The program. The protocols. The fail-safes. I wasn't a survivor of a government experiment. I was its architect. I had designed the truth so it couldn't be born. And now it was waking again. Callie put her hand on my shoulder. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. She had been here before too, in other lives, in other loops. I saw it in her eyes now. We were the same broken record playing until the needle snapped. And this time, the world was out of chances. The console beside the chair powered up. A voice crackled through a speaker hidden behind the wall. My voice. Older. Slower. "If you're ready," it said. "Sit down. It only works if you choose. No one can force this." I sat. The restraints didn't click. The lights didn't dim. But the room grew smaller. Not physically. Psychologically. Like a tunnel collapsing inward. A convergence pulling every life I'd lived into one burning point behind my eyes. Final page of the file. If you choose to remember, you must carry it forever. If you choose to forget, the cycle may repeat. But there is a third path. Write this down. Tell someone. Anyone. The story will rot unless it's witnessed. The screens around me flickered on. Footage. Not of the past. Of the present. Streets filled with people moving in perfect synchronization. Thousands. Millions. Every remnant, every fragment, aligning. The awakening had begun. And yet, the signal paused. Mid-burst. Like it was waiting for a decision. I turned to Adler. He was crying. Not out of fear. Out of guilt. He knew now, too. He'd helped design the satellite uplink 30 years ago. He had forgotten. Just like me. We all had. Because we were never meant to survive the memory. Callie stepped forward. Her voice was steady. Tell the story. And I did. That's what you're reading now. Not a confession. Not a warning. A key. A seed. They can erase people, but not ideas. Not completely. And now that you know, the convergence is broken. Because memory requires multiplicity. And you, reader, are now part of me. I don't know how long I have. The room is dark again. The air tastes of static. But I've written enough. If they find me, let them. If they erase this, someone will remember. The government didn't pay me to survive their experiment. They paid me to forget I started it.